The doors of the great hall flew open before Elena could stop them, and every eye in the room turned toward her at once. "Leave," Damien said. His voice was flat and cold, the voice of a king, not the voice of a mate. "Pack your things and leave this house tonight." For a moment, Elena could not move. The council members sat frozen around the long stone table, their faces pale under the torchlight. Some looked down at their hands, others stared openly, waiting to see what the rejected mate of the Alpha King would do. Elena felt her heart slam against her chest. 3 years of loving this man, of standing beside him through war meetings and harvest festivals, through sleepless nights when their daughter had a fever, through everything a mate bond was supposed to mean. And now he stood at the head of the table, tall and unmoving, looking at her as if she were a stranger who had wandered in off the road. "Damien," she said quietly, "tell me why. I don't owe you an explanation." His jaw was tight. His eyes, usually warm amber, had gone hard and distant. "You have until sunrise." A murmur passed through the council. Lila, the pack's healer, and one of Elena's few real friends, half rose from her chair, but a sharp look from Damien made her sit back down. Nobody in this hall would defy the Alpha King. Not tonight. Elena straightened her spine. She would not cry in front of these people. She would not beg. Whatever had turned her husband into this cold stranger, she refused to let the council watch her fall apart. "Fine," she said. Her voice did not shake, though her hands, hidden in the folds of her dress, were trembling. "I'll be gone before sunrise. You won't need to say it twice." She turned and walked out of the hall with her head high, though every step felt like walking through fire. Behind her, she heard nothing, no footsteps following, no voice calling her back, just silence, and the heavy sound of the doors closing. Only when she reached the empty corridor did she let herself stop. She pressed her back against the cold stone wall and closed her eyes, waiting for the shaking in her chest to pass. It did not pass. It only grew worse. Her daughter, Maya, was 3 years old and asleep in the nursery down the hall. Elena would have to find a way to explain this to her someday, though tonight there was no explaining it to herself. Just hours ago, Damien had kissed her forehead before the council meeting and told her he would see her at supper. Now he was throwing her out like she meant nothing at all. She made her way to their bedroom, the room they had shared since the day they were bonded. It still smelled like him, like cedar and rain. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, staring at the bed where they had held each other through countless nights, and felt something inside her crack open. But there was no time for grief, not yet. Sunrise was coming, and she had a daughter to protect, even if that meant leaving her here with the pack for now, where she would be safe under Lila's watchful eye, until Elena could find a way to bring her along later. It broke her heart to even consider it, but a king's daughter could not simply vanish into the night with no protection, and Elena would not risk her child's safety on unfamiliar roads in the dark. She pulled a leather bag from the closet and began to pack. Practical things first. A warm cloak, a pair of sturdy boots, a pouch of coins she had saved from selling herbs at the market, back before she became the mate of an Alpha King and stopped needing to worry about money. Some dried food. A knife, small but sharp, tucked into her belt. Her hands moved quickly, but her mind would not stop racing. What had happened? Only 2 days ago, Damien had been distracted during their walk through the orchard, his eyes distant, his mind clearly somewhere far away. She had asked him what was wrong, and he had simply shaken his head and said it was nothing, just pack business. She had believed him. She had trusted him completely. Now she wondered if she had ever really known him at all. Her eyes fell on the wardrobe they shared, and without thinking, she opened it and pulled out one of his shirts. It was an old gray one, soft from years of washing, the sleeves slightly too long even for him. He always wore it on quiet mornings, the mornings when he wasn't the Alpha King but just Damien, the man who made her laugh and held their daughter against his chest and hummed old lullabies that didn't quite have a tune. She told herself she was only taking it because it was warm, because the nights on the road would be cold, and she needed every scrap of comfort she could find. That was the excuse she gave herself, as she folded it carefully and placed it at the top of her bag, on top of everything else, where she could reach it first. It had nothing to do with missing him, nothing at all. She repeated that to herself twice, and neither time did she believe it. By the time she finished packing, the moon had shifted low in the sky. She had perhaps 3 hours before dawn. 3 hours to say goodbye to the only home she had known since she was 19 years old. 3 hours to leave behind everything she had built, everyone she loved, everything except the child sleeping peacefully down the hall. She crept to the nursery first. Maya lay curled beneath her blanket, one small fist pressed against her cheek, her dark curls spread across the pillow. Elena knelt beside the bed and pressed the gentlest kiss to her daughter's forehead, careful not to wake her. "I will come back for you," she whispered. "I promise." She did not know if that promise was true. She did not know anything anymore, except that she needed to leave before the sun came up, before the entire pack woke to see the shame of their queen being cast out like a criminal. On her way through the quiet halls, she passed the window that looked out over the training grounds and, beyond them, the stables. And there, in the moonlight, she saw him, Ash, Damien's black stallion, the proudest and most loyal horse in the entire kingdom, a horse that would let no one but Damien ride him, a horse that had once refused an entire line of stable hands who tried to saddle him for a parade. Something hot and reckless sparked in Elena's chest. If Damien wanted to throw her away like she was nothing, if he wanted to erase 3 years of love with 6 cold words in front of the whole council, then she was not leaving quietly with nothing but a bag of clothes and a broken heart. She would take something that mattered to him, something he could not simply replace. She was not proud of the thought. It was petty, maybe even foolish, born from hurt rather than reason. But grief has a strange way of turning into fire, and right now, fire felt a great deal easier to carry than sorrow. She made her way down to the stables, moving silently through the shadows, avoiding the 2 guards who stood half asleep near the gate. She had walked these grounds 1,000 times. She knew every path that kept her out of sight. Ash lifted his great head the moment she stepped inside, his dark eyes catching the moonlight through the open stable door. He was enormous, easily the largest horse in the kingdom's stock, with a coat so black it seemed to drink in the shadows around him. Most people were afraid to even approach his stall. Elena was not afraid. She had fed him apples from her palm 100 times while waiting for Damien to finish training. Ash had always been gentle with her, even when he snapped and reared at everyone else. "Hello, old friend," she murmured, running a hand along his neck. He leaned into her touch, huffing softly. "I need your help tonight." She saddled him with careful, practiced hands, grateful that Damien had once taught her, back in the early days, when he used to laugh more, when he used to pull her onto Ash's back and ride with her through the fields at sunset, just because he wanted to see her smile. Those memories felt like another lifetime now. By the time she led Ash out of the stable, her bag secured behind the saddle, the eastern sky had begun to lighten from black to deep indigo. She had less time than she thought. She swung up into the saddle, gripping the reins, and looked back one last time at the towering shape of the pack house against the fading stars. Somewhere inside those walls, Damien slept, or did not sleep, having just destroyed the life they built together, without a single word of explanation. She would not waste tears on him, not tonight. "Go," she whispered to Ash, and the great horse surged forward into the dark, carrying her away from everything she had ever known. The wind was sharp and cold against her face as they rode, and for a while, Elena let herself feel nothing but the rhythm of hooves against packed earth, the rush of night air, the strange, terrible freedom of having absolutely nothing left to lose. It was easier than thinking, easier than remembering the look in Damien's eyes when he told her to leave, a look that had not been anger, she realized now, but something closer to fear. That thought nagged at her as the miles passed beneath them. Damien was not a cruel man. Whatever else had changed in him these past weeks, he had never once, in 3 years, raised his voice at her in anger, let alone cast her out with no warning at all. Something had happened. Something had frightened him badly enough to make him do this. But she could not go back now, not with the council watching, not with his word already given in front of witnesses. An Alpha King's command, once spoken aloud before his people, could not simply be unspoken. She knew that, as well as anyone. If she returned tonight, she would only shame him further. and shame him in front of a court that already seemed far too eager to see her fall. So she kept riding, deeper into the dark forest that marked the border of Damien's territory, following the old trade road that led toward the neutral lands to the east. She did not know where she was going. She only knew she could not stay. Hours passed. The sky slowly turned from indigo to gray to the palest gold, and still she rode, stopping only once to let Ash drink from a stream, and to eat a small piece of the bread she had packed, though her stomach was too tight with grief to want much of it. It was near mid-morning when she finally allowed herself to stop properly, tucked into a small clearing well off the main road, hidden by a ring of old oak trees. She slid down from the saddle, her legs aching, her whole body heavy with exhaustion she had not let herself feel until now. She sat down against the base of a tree and pulled Damien's gray shirt from her bag, holding it against her chest without quite meaning to. It still smelled like him. Cedar and rain and something warm underneath that she had never been able to name, something that had simply always meant home. For the first time since she had left the great hall, Elena let herself cry. Not loudly, not for long, just enough to release some of the pressure that had been building in her chest since the moment Damien said the word leave. Ash stood nearby, grazing quietly, occasionally lifting his head to look at her, as if checking that she was still there. When the tears finally stopped, she wiped her face and made herself breathe slowly, deliberately, the way Lila had once taught her during a hard birth years ago. In through the nose, out through the mouth, again, again. She thought of Maya, safe in her bed at the pack house, and the thought steadied her more than anything else could have. Whatever had happened tonight, whatever cruel game fate had decided to play with her life, she still had a reason to keep moving forward. She would find safety somewhere. She would find a way to understand what had truly happened, and she would find a way back to her daughter, no matter how long it took. She folded the shirt carefully and placed it back in her bag, this time letting herself admit, quietly, to no one but the trees and the horse and the pale morning sun, that she had kept it because some small, stubborn part of her still loved him, even now, even after everything. She mounted Ash again, turned his head toward the rising sun, and rode on, leaving the world she had known behind her, with no idea that the truth behind Damien's cold command was far more complicated and far more dangerous than she could have imagined. The forest grew thicker as the morning wore on, and the trade road narrowed into little more than a dirt path winding between ancient trees. Elena kept a careful eye on the shadows, remembering every warning Damien had ever given her about the lands beyond pack territory. Out here there was no pack law to keep order, no patrols to chase off wandering rogues. Out here, a lone woman on a fine horse was either very brave or very foolish, and at the moment, Elena was not entirely sure which one she was. Ash seemed to sense her unease. He kept his ears pinned forward, alert, his pace steady but watchful. Elena patted his neck gratefully. Whatever had gone wrong between her and Damien, she was thankful, at least, that she had not chosen this journey without him. Around midday, hunger finally won out over grief, and Elena stopped again to eat properly. She found a fallen log near a narrow stream and sat down, letting Ash graze on the sweet grass nearby. She ate slowly, staring at the water as it moved over smooth stones, and let her mind wander back over the past few weeks, searching for anything she might have missed. There had been small things. Damien coming home later than usual from council meetings, his expression tight and unreadable. A guard posted outside their bedroom door one night, which Damien had brushed off as a routine precaution. A conversation with his uncle, Victor, that had ended abruptly the moment Elena walked into the room, both men falling silent and exchanging a look she had not understood at the time. Victor. The name settled uneasily in her mind. Damien's uncle had never been particularly warm toward her, though he had always been polite enough in public. He was the kind of man who smiled with his mouth but never quite with his eyes, a man who had wanted more influence over pack matters for years and had never quite gotten it while Damien's father was alive. Elena had never given the man much thought before. Now, sitting alone in the middle of a strange forest with a stolen horse and a broken heart, she found herself wondering if Victor had something to do with tonight's disaster. She shook her head, trying to clear the thought. She had no proof of anything, only a feeling, and feelings were a poor substitute for facts, especially when grief was involved. Grief had a way of finding villains everywhere, of needing someone, anyone, to blame for the unbearable pain of being cast aside by the person she loved most in the world. Still, the thought lingered as she finished her meal and continued on her way. If Damien truly loved her once, and she believed with everything in her heart that he had, then something powerful must have changed his mind. Fear did that to people. Fear, or manipulation, or both working together in ways too clever to easily unravel. By late afternoon, the forest began to thin, and Elena could see hills rising in the distance, gentle and green, dotted here and there with small farms. She was leaving pack territory now, crossing into land that belonged to no single alpha, land where travelers of every kind passed through without much notice. It was exactly the kind of place she needed, somewhere she could disappear for a while and figure out her next move. She found a small village just before sunset, tucked into a valley between two hills, with smoke rising from chimneys and the smell of cooking fires drifting on the evening air. It was nothing like the grand halls of the pack house, just simple wooden buildings and dirt roads, but it looked peaceful, and peaceful was more than enough for tonight. She led Ash toward what looked like the only inn in the village, a squat two-story building with a faded sign reading, "The Wandering Fox." Her legs ached from the long ride, and her stomach twisted with nerves as she stepped inside, painfully aware of how out of place she must look, still dressed in the fine clothing of a pack queen, though travel dust now covered the hem of her dress. The innkeeper, a stout older woman with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a tight bun, looked up as Elena entered and studied her for a long moment before speaking. "You look like you've had a hard day, dear," the woman said, not unkindly. "Room and a hot meal?" "Please," Elena managed, her voice rough from hours of silence. "And somewhere safe for my horse." The woman, who introduced herself as Margaret, called for a stable boy to see to Ash, and led Elena to a small but clean room upstairs. It was nothing like the grand chambers Elena was used to, but after the day she'd had, it felt like the safest place in the world. Alone in the room, Elena finally allowed herself to sit on the edge of the narrow bed and simply breathe. Tomorrow she would think about what came next, about how to survive in a world without the pack's protection, about how to find her way back to her daughter. Tonight, she needed only to rest. She pulled Damien's shirt from her bag one more time and held it for a long moment before setting it aside and lying down. Sleep did not come easily, but when it finally did, it carried her far from the great hall, far from the cold look in Damien's eyes, into dreams that, for a few merciful hours, let her forget everything that had gone wrong. Elena woke before dawn, her body stiff from the long ride, her mind clearer than it had been in days. Sunlight had not yet touched the small window of her room at the Wandering Fox, but she could hear Margaret already moving about downstairs, the comforting clatter of pots and the smell of fresh bread rising through the floorboards. She lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling, forcing herself to think through her situation with a clear head rather than a broken heart. She had coin enough to last a few weeks if she was careful. She had Ash, though she knew she would need to be cautious about being seen with such a distinctive horse, one that any pack scout would recognize instantly, and she had her wits, which had served her well enough before she ever became a queen. She rose, washed her face in the basin of cool water Margaret had left for her, and went downstairs to find breakfast waiting. Margaret set a plate of eggs and warm bread in front of her without being asked, along with a cup of something hot and herbal that smelled faintly of mint. "You didn't sleep much," Margaret observed, settling into the chair across from her. "Enough," Elena said, though they both knew it was a lie. Margaret studied her for a long moment, the kind of look that seemed to see straight through the dust and exhaustion to something deeper. "You're not from around here, that much is plain, and that horse of yours isn't a farm animal either." Elena's hand tightened slightly around her cup. "I'm just passing through." Margaret did not push further, though her eyes lingered thoughtfully. "Well, passing through or not, you're welcome to stay as long as you need. Extra hands are always useful around here, if you're willing to work for your keep." The offer was more generous than Elena had expected, and something in her chest loosened slightly at the kindness of it. She had spent 3 years surrounded by council members who watched her every move, calculating what her presence meant for their own standing. Margaret wanted nothing from her except honest help in exchange for honest shelter. "I would like that," Elena said. "Thank you." Over the following days, Elena settled into a quiet rhythm at the inn. She helped with the cooking, learned the names of the regular customers, and spent her afternoons caring for Ash in the small stable behind the building, brushing his coat until it gleamed, murmuring to him the way she once had in the pack stables, back when her life still made sense. It was during these quiet hours that her mind wandered most, circling back again and again to the night Damien had ordered her out of the hall. She replayed every detail, searching for something she might have missed, some clue in his expression, or his words that would explain the sudden coldness in a man who had once looked at her like she was the only person in the world. She thought of Victor more than once, unable to shake the memory of his cold, calculating eyes. She thought, too, of Maya, and the thought was enough to bring fresh tears, more nights than she cared to admit, though she was careful never to let Margaret or anyone else see them. Meanwhile, back within the walls of the pack house, the mood was far from peaceful. Word of the Queen's disappearance had spread through the pack within a single day, whispered from kitchen to courtyard to training ground, though no one dared speak of it openly in front of Damien himself. Damien had not slept since the night Elena left. He sat now in his private study, staring at a letter he had received 2 weeks earlier, the letter that had started all of this. It had come from an old seer in the Northern Territories, a woman whose visions had proven true more than once in the past. The letter spoke of a great darkness that would fall upon the pack, a darkness tied directly to the bloodline of the Alpha's mate. At the time, Damien had dismissed it as superstition, the kind of vague warning that meant nothing and everything at once. But then Victor had come to him, quietly, urgently, with additional information that seemed to confirm the seer's words. Ancient records, Victor claimed, records that spoke of a curse tied to Elena's family line generations back, a curse that would one day bring ruin to whichever pack her bloodline married into. Damien had not wanted to believe it. He had argued, resisted, refused to even consider the idea for days. But Victor had been relentless, bringing more evidence each time, warning that the council itself was growing suspicious, that some members were already calling for Elena's removal by far harsher means than simple banishment. It was that final warning that had broken him. Victor had claimed, with grave sincerity, that if Damien did not act quickly and decisively, certain council members intended to have Elena quietly eliminated to protect the pack from the supposed curse, and that the only way to save her life was to send her away before anyone else could act first. Damien had believed him. He had looked at the letter, at the ancient records Victor produced, at the fear in his uncle's eyes, and he had believed every word. And so he had done the hardest thing he had ever done in his life, casting out the woman he loved more than his own heartbeat, telling himself it was the only way to keep her safe, that a temporary separation was better than watching her die at the hands of his own council. He had not expected the pain to be this unbearable. He had not expected the silence of the pack house to feel this suffocating, every room, every hallway, every corner still holding traces of her laughter, her presence, the warmth she had brought into his life since the day they first met. Now, staring at Victor's supposed ancient records spread across his desk, Damien found himself troubled by something he had not noticed before. The parchment looked far too clean, far too well preserved for documents that were supposedly centuries old. He ran his fingers along the edge of one page, frowning slightly. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Lila entered without waiting for an answer, her expression tight with barely contained anger. "You need to eat something," she said, setting a tray on the corner of his desk. "And you need to tell me what really happened, because I don't believe for one second that you woke up one morning and decided to stop loving your mate." Damien said nothing, his eyes still fixed on the strange documents in front of him. Lila crossed her arms. "Elena is out there somewhere, alone, with no protection and no explanation, and her daughter cries for her every single night. If you had a good reason for this, Damien, now would be the time to share it." "I did it to protect her," Damien said quietly, though even as the words left his mouth, doubt crept into his voice for the first time since Victor's warnings had begun. "Protect her from what?" Damien hesitated, then slowly slid one of the parchments across the desk toward her. Lila picked it up, studying it with the sharp, careful eyes of a healer trained to notice details others missed. Her frown deepened as she examined the ink, the texture of the page, the style of the handwriting. "Damien," she said slowly, "this isn't old. This paper is barely a year worn, if that. Someone treated it to look aged, but look here, along the edges, real old parchment cracks differently than this." A cold feeling began to spread through Damien's chest, the first true crack in the certainty Victor had built so carefully around him. "Victor gave me these," he said. "He said they proved the curse was real." Lila's eyes met his, sharp with sudden understanding. "And who benefits most, Damien, if you send away your mate and lose your focus on running this pack? Who has been trying to gain more influence over the council for years?" The question hung heavy in the air between them, and for the first time since that terrible night in the Great Hall, Damien felt the full weight of what he might have done, not to protect Elena from some ancient curse, but to remove her, quietly and permanently, at the urging of a man who had been planning this for far longer than anyone realized. Damien rose from his desk so quickly that his chair scraped loudly against the stone floor. "Bring Victor to me, now." Lila did not move immediately. "Think carefully before you confront him directly, Damien. If he has been planning something this deliberate, he will not simply confess because you ask nicely. You need proof before you accuse him in front of the council, or he will simply claim you've lost your mind with grief and turn the entire pack against you instead." Her words cut through the anger clouding his thoughts, and Damien forced himself to sit back down, breathing slowly through the fury building in his chest. Lila was right. Victor had spent years cultivating relationships within the council, quietly building alliances, positioning himself as the reasonable voice of caution whenever difficult decisions needed to be made. If Damien accused him without solid evidence, it would be his word against his uncle's, and given how convincingly Victor had already manipulated him once, there was no guarantee the council would side with their king. "Then help me find proof," Damien said. "Everything, Lila. Every letter, every document, every conversation Victor has had with the seer or anyone else involved. I want to know exactly how deep this goes." Lila nodded, some of the tension easing from her shoulders now that Damien seemed to be thinking clearly again. "I'll speak with the seer myself. If her original letter was genuine, she may be able to tell us whether Victor altered her words or added false claims of his own. And I have a friend among the scribes who keeps records of all official pact correspondence. If Victor has been writing to anyone suspicious, there will be a trace of it somewhere." "Do it quietly," Damien said. "I don't want Victor to suspect anything until we have enough to bring before the full council." As Lila left to begin her search, Damien remained alone in his study, staring at the false documents that had convinced him to throw away everything that mattered most. Shame settled heavy in his stomach, a shame far worse than any physical wound he had ever suffered. He had let fear override his judgment. He had let his uncle's carefully constructed lies push him into destroying the one thing in his life that had never once given him reason for doubt. Elena had never lied to him, not once, in 3 years, and he had repaid that honesty by casting her out with 6 cruel words and no explanation, leaving her to face the world alone, with nothing but whatever she managed to grab in the chaos of that terrible night. He thought suddenly of his prize stallion and rose to check the stables, some instinct telling him something was missing before he even reached the door. Sure enough, Ash's stall stood empty, the saddle gone along with him. A strange, unexpected warmth cut through the guilt in Damien's chest. Elena had taken Ash. Of everything she could have grabbed on her way out, she had taken the one animal in the kingdom that meant the most to him, the horse that trusted no one else, the horse that had been his closest companion since before he ever became king. It should have angered him. Instead, standing alone in the quiet stable, Damien found himself almost smiling through the pain, a small, aching recognition of the fire that had always lived inside Elena, the same fire that had first drawn him to her all those years ago. She had not left quietly. She had left with a message, even if she hadn't meant to send one. "I am not nothing. You cannot simply erase me." He would find her, whatever it took, however long the search required. He would find her and make right what he had broken. But first, he needed to expose Victor and dismantle the lies that had led him to this point in the first place. Meanwhile, far to the east, Elena's days at the Wandering Fox had settled into something almost peaceful, though the ache in her chest never fully disappeared. She woke early each morning to help Margaret prepare breakfast for the inn's guests, spent her afternoons tending to Ash and helping around the small property, and in the evenings, she sat by the fire listening to the stories of travelers passing through, merchants and wanderers who carried news from every corner of the region. It was through one of these travelers, a quiet young man named Caleb who traded in dried goods between villages, that Elena first heard whispers that made her blood run cold. "Strange business up in the northern packs," Caleb said one evening, warming his hands by the fire while Margaret refilled his cup. "Heard tell the Alpha King sent his own mate away without cause, no one knows why. Some say she ran off on her own, others say he cast her out. Either way, there's talk of scouts being sent out to search the eastern roads." Elena's hands went still where she sat mending a torn shirt near the window. Scouts, searching the eastern roads, the very road she had traveled to reach this village. She kept her expression carefully neutral, though her heart pounded hard against her ribs. "Do you know why he sent her away?" she asked, keeping her voice light, curious rather than desperate. Caleb shrugged. "Rumors say something about a curse, ancient bloodline nonsense, the kind of story that gets more dramatic with every telling. Personally, I think it's more likely some kind of political trouble within the pack itself. Wouldn't be the first time an Alpha's advisors pushed him into a decision he later regretted." Political trouble, the words settled uneasily in Elena's mind, as she finished her mending and excused herself for the evening, claiming exhaustion, though sleep felt impossibly far away once she reached the privacy of her room. If scouts were being sent to search the eastern roads, it meant either Damien wanted her found and brought back, which seemed unlikely given the coldness in his voice that terrible night, or someone else wanted her found for reasons far less kind. She thought again of Victor, of the strange tension she had sensed in the weeks before her banishment, of the guard posted outside her door that Damien had dismissed so quickly as routine precaution. She could not stay here much longer. As much as she had come to appreciate Margaret's kindness and the quiet rhythm of village life, she could not risk being found, not until she understood exactly what danger she might be facing, and from whom. The next morning, she found Margaret in the kitchen and explained, as vaguely as she dared, that she needed to move on soon, that staying too long in one place might bring trouble to the inn's door. Margaret did not press for details, though her eyes held a knowing sympathy that suggested she understood more than Elena had said aloud. "There's a settlement 2 days' ride south of here," Margaret offered. "Larger than this village, harder to search thoroughly if someone's looking. My sister lives there, runs a shop selling herbs and remedies. Tell her Margaret sent you, and she'll help you find honest work without asking too many questions." Elena felt a rush of gratitude so strong it nearly brought fresh tears to her eyes. "Thank you, for everything." "Just be careful out there," Margaret said, pulling her into a brief, warm embrace. "Whatever trouble follows you, I hope you find your way through it." 2 days later, Elena packed her few belongings once more, tucking Damien's gray shirt carefully at the bottom of her bag, alongside the other items she had accumulated during her stay. She saddled Ash in the pale light of early morning and rode south, away from the whispers of scouts on the eastern roads, toward whatever uncertain future awaited her next. As she rode, she found herself thinking less about the pain of that terrible night in the Great Hall and more about survival, about strategy, about the growing certainty that something far larger than a simple lover's quarrel had torn her life apart. Someone had wanted her gone. The only question that remained was who, and why, and how she might ever find her way back to the truth, let alone back to her daughter, waiting patiently at the pack house for a mother who had promised to return. The settlement Margaret had described turned out to be a bustling market town called Hollow Creek, far busier than the quiet village Elena had left behind. Streets were lined with shops and stalls, the air filled with the sounds of merchants calling out prices, and the clatter of cartwheels against cobblestone. It was exactly the kind of place where a stranger could disappear into the crowd, and Elena felt a small measure of relief as she guided Ash through the busy streets toward the address Margaret had given her. Margaret's sister, a sharp-eyed woman named Grace, ran a small shop near the edge of the market square, its shelves lined with jars of dried herbs, tinctures, and remedies for everything from headaches to fever. Grace looked up when Elena entered, studying her with the same assessing gaze her sister had given days before. "Margaret sent word ahead," Grace said, before Elena could even explain herself. "Said you might need work, and a place to stay that doesn't ask too many questions." "That would be a great help," Elena admitted. Grace nodded toward the back of the shop. "I could use someone who knows plants. Do you?" Elena thought of the years she had spent learning herbal medicine before she ever met Damien, skills she had continued practicing, even after becoming queen, often working alongside Lila in the pack's healing house. "I do," she said. "More than most, actually." Grace's eyebrows rose slightly, clearly not expecting such confidence, but she said nothing more, simply gesturing for Elena to follow her into the back room, where dried herbs hung from the rafters in neat, fragrant bundles. Over the next hour, Elena demonstrated her knowledge, identifying plants, explaining their uses, correcting 2 labels that Grace herself had gotten wrong. By the time they finished, Grace was looking at her with open respect. "You'll do just fine here," Grace said. "There's a small room above the shop you can use, and I'll pay you fairly for honest work. That horse of yours, though," she added, glancing out the window toward where Ash stood tied nearby, drawing curious looks from passers-by. "You'll want to keep him out of sight as much as possible. Not many farm horses look like that." Elena felt a flicker of unease at the observation, but nodded in agreement. She would need to be more careful from now on, more deliberate about avoiding attention, even in a town as busy as this one. Over the following weeks, Elena settled into a new rhythm of life in Hollow Creek. She worked alongside Grace each day, mixing remedies and helping customers, slowly rebuilding a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with being anyone's queen or anyone's mate. In the evenings, she cared for Ash in the small stable behind the shop, and on quiet nights, she allowed herself to think of Maya, wondering if her daughter was sleeping well, if Lila was keeping a close enough watch over her, if anyone had told her anything at all about why her mother had disappeared. She made careful, quiet inquiries whenever travelers passed through the shop, listening for any news from the northern pack territories, though she was careful never to ask too directly. Most of what she heard was vague and unreliable, rumors twisted through multiple retellings, but a pattern began to emerge nonetheless. The Alpha King had grown withdrawn since his mate's disappearance. Council meetings had grown tense, and most troubling of all, more than one traveler mentioned hearing that scouts had been sent out not just along the eastern roads, but in every direction, searching with an urgency that seemed far greater than a simple domestic matter would warrant. Elena did not know what to make of this information, torn between hope that Damien might be searching for her out of love and regret, and fear that the search was being driven by someone with far darker intentions. She thought often of Victor, unable to shake the growing certainty that he was somehow at the center of whatever had happened. Back at the pack house, that certainty was quickly becoming fact. Lila had spent weeks working carefully behind the scenes, speaking with the seer in the Northern Territories through a trusted messenger, and slowly piecing together a trail of evidence that painted a damning picture of Victor's involvement. The seer, it turned out, had never mentioned any curse tied to Elena's bloodline at all. Her original letter, which Lila finally obtained a true copy of through the messenger, spoke only in vague terms of coming challenges facing the pack, the kind of generic warning that could apply to almost any leader, in almost any circumstance. Victor had taken that vague warning and twisted it, adding details about bloodlines and ancient curses that existed nowhere in the seer's actual words, then forging supporting documents to make his fabrication seem credible. "He's been planning this for months," Lila told Damien one evening, spreading the evidence across his desk. "Look at the dates on these letters. He began corresponding with the seer's assistant, bribing him for information, long before he ever brought the supposed curse to your attention. This wasn't panic or genuine concern, Damien. This was calculated from the very beginning." Damien stared at the evidence, jaw tight with barely controlled fury. "Why? What does he gain from destroying my marriage?" "Think about it," Lila said quietly. "With Elena gone, you've been distracted, withdrawn, barely attending to pack business these past weeks. Who has been quietly taking over more and more of your responsibilities during that time? Who has been making decisions in council meetings, while you've been too consumed by grief to pay close attention?" The answer settled over Damien like a physical weight. Victor had been doing exactly that, stepping smoothly into gaps Damien had left open in his grief, positioning himself as the steady hand, guiding the pack through a difficult time. Was subtle, patient, exactly the kind of long game a man like Victor would play. He wants control of the pack, Damien said slowly. I believe so, Lila confirmed. And I believe he intended for this separation to become permanent. If Elena never returned, if the marriage simply dissolved under mysterious circumstances, you would eventually need to remarry to secure the pack's future. And who do you imagine would have significant influence over who that new mate might be? Damien's hands curled into fists on the desktop. The full scope of Victor's betrayal was becoming horribly clear. A scheme built not on any real threat to the pack, but on naked ambition disguised as loyalty and caution. We need more before I can bring this to the council, Damien said finally, forcing himself to think strategically despite the anger burning through him. Victor is careful. If we move too soon, he'll simply deny everything and claim we're grasping at explanations to avoid facing an uncomfortable truth. Then we find more, Lila said firmly. And in the meantime, you need to find Elena. Wherever she is, whatever she believes about why you sent her away, she deserves to know the truth as soon as possible. Every day she spends out there alone and confused is a day too long. Damien nodded, resolve hardening in his chest. He would expose Victor's lies, however long it took, and he would find Elena and bring her home, not as a favor or an act of mercy, but as a genuine reckoning for the terrible mistake he had made in trusting his uncle's word over his own heart. He only hoped that when he finally found her, it would not already be too late to earn back her trust. Victor noticed the change before anyone told him anything directly. He had spent enough years navigating pack politics to recognize the subtle shift in how people looked at him, the way certain council members grew quieter when he entered a room, the way Lila had stopped bringing him routine reports she once shared freely. Something had changed, and Victor's instincts, sharpened by years of careful maneuvering, told him it was not a change in his favor. He confirmed his suspicions late one night when he caught sight of a messenger slipping out of the pack house through a side entrance, moving with the careful haste of someone trying not to be noticed. Victor recognized the messenger as one Lila had used before for personal errands, and a cold certainty settled over him. Someone was investigating him. Someone had grown suspicious of the documents he had provided, the evidence he had so carefully constructed to convince Damien that Elena needed to be removed. He could not allow this investigation to continue unchecked. If Damien discovered the full truth before Victor secured his position, everything he had worked toward for years would collapse in an instant, and the consequences for deceiving an Alpha King so thoroughly would be severe indeed. Victor spent that night in his private chambers, weighing his options carefully. He had allies within the pack, loyal men who owed their positions and their comfortable lives to his patronage over the years. It was time to call in those favors, before it was too late. He summoned two of his most trusted men before dawn, men who had served him quietly for years, handling matters too delicate or too dangerous for official pack business. The Queen must be found, he told them, keeping his voice low despite the empty corridor around them. Before she returns to the pack house, and before Damien's search efforts locate her first, I want her found and dealt with quietly, in a way that raises no further questions. The larger of the two men, a hardened tracker named Roth, studied Victor with narrowed eyes. Dealt with how, exactly? Victor met his gaze steadily. However necessary, she cannot be allowed to return and speak with Damien directly. Too much is at stake. Roth exchanged a brief look with his companion before nodding slowly. We'll need resources: coin, horses, time. You'll have all three, Victor promised. Just move quickly. I have reason to believe she may have traveled east, toward the neutral territories. Start your search there. As the two men slipped away into the pre-dawn darkness, Victor allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction. He had not wanted matters to escalate this far, but Elena's continued existence, and the growing possibility of her return, had become far too dangerous to ignore. If removing her permanently was the price of protecting everything he had built, then so be it. He had no way of knowing that his own carelessness that night, dispatching men so openly, so close to dawn, had been witnessed by a young stable hand who happened to be tending to an early morning delivery of feed. The boy, confused by the strange late-night meeting and Victor's unusually harsh tone, mentioned it in passing to one of the kitchen staff the following morning, who mentioned it to another servant, who eventually, through the winding chain of packhouse gossip, mentioned it to Lila. Lila brought the news to Damien immediately, her expression grave. A stable hand overheard Victor sending 2 men out before dawn this morning, with instructions to find Elena, and in his words, deal with her quietly. The color drained from Damien's face. Deal with her. I don't like the sound of it any more than you do, Lila said. We need to move now, Damien. Whatever proof we still lack, we cannot wait for it while Victor's men have a head start searching for Elena, with intentions far worse than simple relocation. Damien was already moving, calling for his most trusted warriors, men who had served under him for years, and whose loyalty he trusted without question. Gather every scout we have, he ordered. I want the Eastern Territories searched immediately, every village, every road. And someone bring me everything we know about where Victor's man Roth typically operates. If he's the one leading this search, I want to know his usual routes before he gets too far ahead of us. Within the hour, Damien had assembled a small but capable group of trackers, men whose skill in the field rivaled even Roth's considerable reputation. He briefed them quickly on the situation, deliberately vague about the full political implications, but clear about the urgency of finding Elena before anyone else did. We ride within the hour, Damien said, buckling on his sword with hands that shook slightly. Whether from fear or fury, he could no longer easily tell. And Lila, I need you to keep working on that evidence against Victor. The moment we return with Elena safe, I want enough proof to bring him before the full council, without any doubt remaining. Lila nodded firmly. I won't stop until we have it. As Damien mounted his horse and prepared to ride out into the gray light of early morning, he allowed himself one brief, painful thought of Elena, wherever she was, unaware of the danger now closing in around her, unaware that the man who had cast her out with such cold cruelty was now racing against time itself to protect her from a threat far greater than his own foolish mistake. He only hoped he would reach her in time. Far to the south, in the busy streets of Hollow Creek, Elena had no idea that danger was approaching from 2 directions at once. She continued her quiet work at Grace's shop, her days settling into a rhythm that almost let her forget, for brief stretches at a time, the chaos that had upended her life weeks earlier. It was a chance encounter that first alerted her to trouble. A traveling merchant, passing through the market square, mentioned to Grace within Elena's hearing that he had crossed paths with 2 rough-looking men several villages back, men who had been asking pointed questions about a woman traveling alone with a distinctive black horse. Elena's blood ran cold as she listened, pretending to busy herself with sorting a shipment of dried lavender while straining to hear every word. Strange men, the merchant continued, oblivious to the tension gathering in the room. Not friendly either. Offered good coin for information, but there was something about the way they asked that made my skin crawl, like they weren't looking to help this woman find her way home. Grace glanced briefly toward Elena, her expression carefully neutral, though Elena could see the concern flickering behind her eyes. After the merchant left, Grace closed the shop early and pulled Elena into the back room. You need to tell me the truth now, Grace said quietly. Who exactly is looking for you, and why? Elena hesitated only a moment before deciding that honesty, at least with someone who had shown her nothing but kindness, was the only reasonable path forward. She explained everything, the sudden banishment, the strange coldness in Damien's eyes, her growing suspicion that his Uncle Victor had manipulated the entire situation, for reasons she still did not fully understand. Grace listened without interruption, her expression growing increasingly troubled as the story unfolded. If men have been sent to track you down, and they're not friendly, as that merchant described, then you're in far more danger than a simple family dispute would explain, she said finally. You need to leave Hollow Creek. Tonight, if possible. Elena's stomach twisted with dread, the peaceful rhythm of the past few weeks, shattering all at once. Where would I even go? Grace thought for a moment, then reached for a scrap of paper and began writing quickly. There's a hidden settlement in the hill country, far off the main roads, home to people who value privacy above almost anything else. "Show them this," she said, handing Elena the folded paper, "and tell them Grace sent you. They'll help you disappear until this danger passes." Elena accepted the paper with trembling hands, gratitude and fear tangling together in her chest. "Thank you, Grace, for everything." "Just be careful," Grace said, pulling her into a brief, fierce embrace. "And Elena, whatever happens, don't let anyone convince you that you deserve any of this. Whatever mistakes were made, they weren't yours." That night, under cover of darkness, Elena saddled Ash once more and rode out of Hollow Creek, leaving behind the quiet life she had begun to build, moving deeper into hidden territory, with 2 dangerous men somewhere behind her, and an Alpha King search party, unbeknownst to her, racing to close the distance from the opposite direction. The hill country was unlike anything Elena had encountered on her journey so far, a rugged landscape of steep slopes and narrow valleys, where the road, such as it was, twisted and climbed through dense woodland that seemed to swallow sound itself. She rode through the night and into the early hours of morning, pushing Ash harder than she liked, but the memory of Grace's warning kept her moving despite her exhaustion. She had traveled perhaps 3 hours into the hills when she first heard it, the distant sound of hoofbeats behind her, moving fast along the same narrow trail. Elena's heart lurched painfully in her chest. She pulled Ash off the main path immediately, guiding him into a dense thicket of trees, pressing her hand gently against his neck to keep him calm and quiet. The hoofbeats grew closer, and through the gaps in the foliage, Elena caught sight of 2 riders passing along the trail, moving with grim purpose, their faces hard and unfamiliar. They were not simply travelers passing through. Something about their posture, the way their eyes scanned the surrounding woods with practiced intensity, told Elena immediately that these were the men the merchant had described. She held perfectly still, barely breathing, until the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance ahead of her. Only then did she allow herself to exhale, her whole body trembling with the aftermath of fear. She could not continue along the main trail now, not with those men somewhere ahead of her, potentially waiting or doubling back if they realized they had passed her. She studied Grace's hastily drawn map by the faint light of early dawn, searching for an alternate route, and found a smaller path branching off through a narrow ravine that appeared to lead toward the same hidden settlement, though it looked considerably more difficult to navigate. It took the better part of the day to make her way through the ravine, guiding Ash carefully over uneven ground, twice having to dismount and lead him by hand through sections too narrow or too steep for riding. By the time the settlement finally came into view, tucked into a hidden valley surrounded by protective hills on nearly every side, Elena was utterly exhausted, her hands scraped and her legs trembling with fatigue. The settlement itself was small, perhaps 24 simple homes clustered around a central well, with wary faces watching her approach from doorways and windows. An older man with a weathered face and steady eyes stepped forward to meet her before she had even fully dismounted. "You're a long way from anywhere, traveling alone," he said, his tone cautious but not unkind. Elena pulled Grace's note from her bag with shaking hands and offered it to him. "Grace sent me. She said you might be willing to help someone who needs to disappear for a while." The man studied the note carefully, then looked back up at Elena with renewed interest. "Grace doesn't send people here lightly. Come, you look like you're about to fall from that horse. We'll talk once you've had food and rest." The man, who introduced himself as Nathan, led Elena to a small guest house at the edge of the settlement, where an older woman brought warm food and clean water without asking a single question. Elena ate gratefully, her body finally beginning to relax now that she was surrounded by walls again, hidden from whatever pursuit might still be searching the hills behind her. That evening, once she had rested enough to think clearly, Elena sat with Nathan by a small fire and explained her situation as briefly as she could manage: the banishment, the growing evidence of manipulation, and now the 2 men who had been asking dangerous questions about her whereabouts. Nathan listened with the patient attention of someone who had heard many difficult stories over the years. "This settlement exists precisely for people caught in situations like yours," he said when she finished. "Pack politics, family disputes, dangerous entanglements of every kind. We ask no questions beyond what people choose to share, and we protect those who come to us in good faith." I don't know how long I'll need to stay, Elena admitted. Stay as long as you need, Nathan said simply. The hills protect us well. Those men searching for you would need to be remarkably skilled trackers to find this place, and even then, our people would know long before they arrived close enough to cause trouble. For the first time in weeks, Elena allowed herself to feel something close to safety. She spent the following days settling into the rhythm of the small settlement, helping wherever her skills proved useful, tending the small garden of medicinal herbs that grew near the guest house, and slowly, cautiously, allowing herself to breathe without the constant weight of fear pressing against her chest. Ash, too, seemed to relax in the quiet safety of the hidden valley, grazing peacefully in the small paddock Nathan's people had prepared for him, though Elena noticed he still lifted his head sharply at every unfamiliar sound, ever watchful, just as he had always been. Elena often found herself sitting near the paddock in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the surrounding hills in shades of gold and rose. Damien's gray shirt folded neatly in her lap, her thoughts drifting inevitably back to the life she had left behind. She wondered how her investigation into Victor's involvement, however limited by her current circumstances, might eventually connect with whatever was happening back at the pack house. She wondered if Damien had discovered the truth yet, if he even suspected his uncle's betrayal, or if he remained convinced that sending her away had somehow protected her from a threat that had never truly existed. She did not know that, at that very moment, Damien and his search party were combing through village after village along the eastern roads, growing increasingly desperate as each search turned up nothing, and that Roth and his companion, having lost her trail somewhere in the twisting paths of the hill country, were beginning to consider new and more dangerous methods of locating their target. The hidden settlement offered safety, but Elena understood, even in her moments of relative peace, that safety here could not last forever. Eventually, she would need to find a way to confront the truth directly, to return and face whatever awaited her at the pack house, whether that meant clearing her name, protecting her daughter, or finally understanding exactly why the man she loved had once looked at her with such devastating coldness in his eyes. For now, though, she allowed herself simply to rest, to heal, and to gather her strength for whatever challenges still lay ahead. 10 days into the search, Damien's patience had worn dangerously thin. He and his trackers had covered nearly every village along the eastern roads, following whatever scraps of information they could gather, but Elena remained frustratingly out of reach, her trail growing colder with each passing day. Worse still, reports had begun trickling back to him about 2 men matching Roth's description, asking similar questions in the same villages, sometimes mere days ahead of Damien's own search party. It was in a small trading post that Damien finally caught a solid lead, an innkeeper who remembered a woman with a striking black horse who had stayed briefly, weeks earlier, before continuing south. Damien redirected his search immediately, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. South meant Hollow Creek, a larger settlement where Elena might have found more substantial shelter, but it also meant she was still moving, still fleeing, and Roth's men were somewhere along that same path, possibly closer to her than Damien's own search party. While Damien pushed his search southward, back at the pack house, Lila had finally gathered enough concrete evidence to move forward. Her careful investigation had uncovered not only the forged documents and the seer's true, unaltered letter, but also written correspondence between Victor and the scribe he had bribed, correspondence that laid out his scheme in Victor's own handwriting, discussing the details of his plan to manufacture the false curse and manipulate Damien into removing Elena from the pack. Lila brought this evidence before the full council, calling an emergency session despite Damien's absence, understanding that every day of delay increased the danger to Elena's life. The council members listened in stunned silence as Lila laid out the evidence piece by piece, watching Victor's composed expression slowly crack under the weight of proof he could no longer easily dismiss. "These documents are forgeries," Victor protested, though his voice lacked its usual confident authority. "Anyone could have written that correspondence and attributed it to me." "The scribe has confirmed everything," Lila said firmly, gesturing toward a nervous young man standing near the back of the hall, the same scribe Victor had bribed months earlier, now cooperating fully, after Lila had promised him leniency in exchange for the truth. "He has testified in full detail about the payments he received from you. About the specific instructions you gave him to alter the seer's original letter. The scribe nodded miserably, unable to meet Victor's furious gaze. It's true, he said quietly. Everything Lila has said is true. I'm sorry, but I couldn't keep lying. Not once I understood what it had already cost the Queen. The council chamber erupted into outraged murmurs. Council members who had once respected Victor, now looking at him with open suspicion and anger. Victor's carefully maintained composure finally shattered, his face twisting with fury, as he realized his scheme was unraveling in real time before the very people whose trust he had spent years cultivating. You don't understand what I was trying to accomplish, Victor snarled, abandoning any pretense of innocence now that denial had clearly failed. This pack needed stronger leadership than Damien has provided these past years, distracted as he's been by sentiment and affection, rather than sound strategy. I did what was necessary to secure our future. You did what was necessary to secure our future, Lila corrected sharply, at the cost of an innocent woman's safety and a family torn apart by your lies. That is not leadership, Victor. That is betrayal. Before Victor could respond further, the council chamber doors burst open, and Damien himself strode inside, travel-worn and exhausted from days on the road, having received an urgent message from Lila that reached him just as he entered pack territory again. His eyes swept the room, taking in Victor's furious, cornered expression, the evidence spread across the table, the scribe's tearful confession, and understanding crystallized instantly in his mind. It's true then, Damien said, his voice dangerously quiet as he approached his uncle. Everything Lila suspected. You fabricated this entire curse to manipulate me into casting out my own mate. Victor's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, apparently recognizing that further denial would accomplish little, now that the truth stood so plainly before the entire council. And now, Damien continued, his voice rising with barely controlled fury, I understand you've sent men after her as well, men with instructions to deal with her quietly. Tell me I'm wrong, Victor. Tell me you didn't send Roth and his companion to hunt down an innocent woman because you feared what might happen if she ever returned to speak the truth. The silence that followed was answer enough. Victor's expression hardened into something cold and defiant, any remaining pretense of remorse vanishing entirely. She was a threat to everything I built, he said flatly. I did what needed to be done. Damien's control snapped. He crossed the remaining distance between them in 3 quick strides, gripping the front of Victor's robes with a strength that made the older man stumble backward. You sent men to hurt her, he said, his voice shaking with rage he could barely contain. The mother of my child, the woman I have loved since I was barely more than a boy. And you sit here calmly telling me it needed to be done. Damien, Lila said sharply, stepping forward with a hand raised in caution. He's not worth the consequences of losing control now. We need him alive and able to answer for his crimes before the full council, not silenced by your own hands in a moment of fury. It took every ounce of remaining discipline Damien possessed to release his grip on Victor's robes and step back, breathing hard, his hands still trembling with barely restrained anger. Take him to the holding cells, he ordered the nearby guards, his voice cold and final. He will answer for everything he has done, in full view of this entire pack. As guards moved to restrain Victor, the older man's composure finally cracked entirely, his voice rising in desperate protest as he was led from the chamber. You'll thank me eventually, Damien. A pack led by sentiment instead of strategy will fall apart within a generation. I only did what you were too weak to do yourself. Damien did not respond, watching in grim silence as his uncle was dragged from the room, the doors closing firmly behind him. The chamber remained heavy with tension for a long moment before Damien finally turned to Lila, exhaustion and urgency warring in his expression. Roth and his men, he said. Do we know where they might be by now? Reports placed them somewhere south of Hollow Creek, last we heard, Lila said. But that was 3 days ago. They could be anywhere by now. Damien's jaw tightened with renewed determination. Then we ride south again, immediately, with every capable tracker we can gather. Victor's crimes are exposed, but that means nothing if his men reach Elena before we do. Within the hour, a larger, more urgent search party rode out from the pack house, Damien at its head, driven now not by uncertainty or doubt, but by the full, terrible knowledge of exactly what danger Elena still faced, and exactly how little time might remain to reach her before Roth's men finished the task Victor had set in motion. Roth had spent nearly 2 weeks searching the hill country with mounting frustration, following faint traces of a trail that seemed to vanish and reappear without clear pattern. He was a skilled tracker, among the best Victor had ever employed, but the woman he hunted had proven more resourceful than he expected, and the rugged terrain offered countless places for a careful traveler to disappear. It was a stroke of luck, or perhaps simple persistence, that finally led him toward the hidden valley. A farmer several miles out, paid generously for information, mentioned rumors of a secretive settlement tucked somewhere in the surrounding hills, a place known among certain travelers for offering shelter to those who needed to disappear. Roth studied the terrain carefully, noting the natural barriers that made the settlement difficult to approach directly, and began planning his approach with the patient calculation that had made him valuable to men like Victor for years. He would wait for nightfall, when the settlement's defenses would be at their weakest, and move quickly before anyone had time to organize meaningful resistance. Elena, unaware of how close danger had crept, spent that particular evening exactly as she had spent most evenings during her weeks at the settlement, sitting near Ash's paddock as the sun set over the surrounding hills, Damien's shirt resting across her lap, while her thoughts wandered between grief and cautious hope. It was one of the settlement's younger residents, a sharp-eyed boy named Felix, who often kept watch along the ridge above the valley, who first spotted movement in the tree line as darkness fell. He raced down the hillside path to alert Nathan, breathless with urgency. 2 riders, he reported. Moving careful, like they don't want to be seen, coming from the north ridge. Nathan's expression darkened immediately. He had lived long enough in these hills to recognize the signs of trouble approaching, and 2 careful riders moving under cover of darkness toward a settlement known for hiding vulnerable people was rarely good news. He gathered several of the settlement's able-bodied residents quickly, men and women who had trained for exactly this kind of threat, and sent word for Elena to be brought to him immediately. "They've found this place," Nathan told her grimly once she arrived, still catching her breath from the hurried walk across the settlement. 2 riders approaching from the north, moving with the kind of caution that suggests they don't want witnesses to whatever they're planning. Elena's stomach dropped with cold, familiar dread. "Roth. Whoever they are, we won't let them reach you easily," Nathan said firmly. "But you need to be ready to move if our defenses don't hold. There's an escape path through the southern ridge, steep but passable on horseback. If things go badly, you take that path and don't look back, no matter what you hear behind you." Elena's hands trembled as she nodded, hurrying to saddle Ash while Nathan and several others positioned themselves strategically around the settlement's northern approach, using the natural cover of rocks and trees to prepare an ambush of their own, rather than waiting passively to be found. The confrontation, when it came, unfolded quickly and violently in the darkness. Roth and his companion, expecting to find an undefended settlement of simple farmers, were met instead by Nathan's carefully positioned defenders, and a tense standoff erupted along the northern ridge, shouts, and the clash of steel echoing through the quiet valley. From her position near the southern path, Elena could hear the commotion growing louder, closer, and her heart pounded with a mixture of terror and fierce determination. She would not simply flee while people who had shown her nothing but kindness fought to protect her. But even as the thought formed, she understood the wisdom of Nathan's instructions. If she stayed and was captured, or worse, everything the settlement had risked would be for nothing. She mounted Ash, forcing herself to wait, watching the tree line anxiously for any sign of how the confrontation was unfolding. Minutes stretched painfully long, each one filled with distant shouts, and the occasional sharp cry that made her flinch with fear for the people fighting to keep her safe. Finally, a young woman came sprinting down the southern path, breathless and urgent. "Nathan says go now." One of the riders broke through the eastern flank. "He's circling around toward the paddock." Elena did not hesitate further. She urged Ash forward along the steep southern path exactly as Nathan had instructed, the horse navigating the treacherous terrain with sure, careful steps despite the darkness pressing in around them. Behind her, she could hear hoofbeats pursuing, closer than she liked, and she pressed low against Ash's neck, urging him faster despite the danger of the uneven ground. The chase carried them out of the hidden valley and into open hill country beyond, moonlight offering just enough visibility to navigate the winding trails. Elena's pursuer, whoever he was, remained relentlessly close behind, and she understood with growing dread that Ash, despite his speed and strength, could not maintain this pace indefinitely across such difficult terrain. She was searching desperately for any advantage, any place to hide, or any way to lose her pursuer among the hills, when she suddenly heard new sounds joining the chase, additional hoofbeats thundering from somewhere ahead of her rather than behind. For one terrifying moment, she feared she had ridden directly into a second group of attackers. Instead, as the new riders came into view, moonlight catching briefly on familiar colors and markings, Elena felt her heart nearly stop with shock and disbelief. It was Damien, riding at the head of a search party of his own trackers, having finally closed the distance on Roth's trail after days of relentless pursuit. He caught sight of Elena immediately, recognizing Ash's distinctive silhouette even in the darkness, and understanding instantly the danger of the rider chasing close behind her. "Elena," Damien's voice cut through the night, filled with a desperate urgency she had never heard from him before. He spurred his horse forward, angling to intercept her pursuer, while his trackers moved to surround the remaining threat. The confrontation that followed was brief and decisive, Damien's men quickly overwhelming Roth's lone rider, who surrendered rather than face impossible odds against a full search party. Within minutes, the immediate danger had passed, leaving only the sound of heavy breathing and racing hearts echoing across the quiet hillside. Elena reined Ash to a stop, her whole body shaking with the aftermath of fear and adrenaline, staring across the moonlit distance at Damien as he dismounted and began walking slowly toward her, his expression a raw, unguarded mixture of relief, guilt, and desperate hope. "Elena," he said again, softer this time, stopping a careful distance away, as though afraid that coming any closer might shatter the fragile moment between them. "I am so sorry. For everything. I was wrong, and I have spent every day since that terrible night trying to find you and make this right." Elena said nothing for a long moment, still trying to process the sudden collision of danger and relief, and the overwhelming presence of the man who had both broken her heart and, apparently, spent weeks risking everything to find her again. "You have a great deal to explain," she finally managed, her voice unsteady but firm. "And I am not ready to simply forgive everything because you showed up at the right moment tonight." "I know," Damien said quietly. "I don't expect forgiveness. I only ask for the chance to explain everything, and to make right what I broke, however long that takes." Behind them, Nathan and several settlement defenders arrived on foot, having successfully repelled Roth's remaining companion, and the tense standoff of moments earlier began settling into something calmer, though far from fully resolved. Elena looked between Damien's exhausted, hopeful face and the dark hills surrounding them, understanding that whatever came next, the truth would finally have to be spoken aloud between them, no matter how difficult that conversation might prove to be. Nathan offered his settlement's hospitality once more, and though Elena still felt the weight of shock from the night's events pressing against her chest, she accepted gratefully, needing solid walls and a quiet place to gather her thoughts before facing the conversation that now felt unavoidable. Damien's trackers made camp at the edge of the valley, while Damien himself was given space near the guest house, close enough that Elena knew he was there, waiting, but far enough that she did not feel crowded by his presence. She did not sleep that night, her mind turning over everything that had happened, the confusion of Roth's men, the desperate relief of Damien's arrival, and the anger that still burned steadily beneath the surface of her exhaustion. When dawn finally broke over the hills, she found Damien already awake, sitting alone near the paddock where Ash grazed peacefully, looking as though he had not slept at all either. He rose when he saw her approaching, his expression cautious, as though uncertain whether she wanted him near her at all. "I'll explain everything," he said quietly. "Whatever questions you have, I'll answer them honestly, even if the answers make me look as foolish and weak as I truly was." Elena settled onto a nearby bench, arms crossed, studying him with careful, guarded eyes. "Start from the beginning." Damien told her everything, the seer's original vague letter, Victor's careful manipulation, the fabricated curse, and forged documents, designed to convince him that removing Elena was the only way to protect her from council members supposedly plotting far worse. He spoke of his own shame at believing such an obvious deception, of the weeks spent tearing himself apart with guilt once Lila's investigation revealed the full extent of Victor's lies, and finally, of learning that Victor had sent men to hunt her down permanently rather than simply ensure her exile. Elena listened in silence, her expression unreadable, though her hands trembled slightly in her lap as the full scope of the betrayal became clear. When Damien finally finished, the clearing fell into heavy silence, broken only by the sound of ash shifting in the paddock nearby. "You believed him," Elena said finally, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "You believed a stranger's fabricated warning, and your uncle's forged documents over 3 years of marriage, over everything we built together. You looked at me in that hall and told me to leave without even asking if I might have an explanation, without giving me a single chance to defend myself." "I know," Damien said, his voice breaking slightly. "There is no excuse that makes that choice acceptable. I was frightened, and fear made me foolish, and I have hated myself every single day since for the way I handled that night. I should have come to you first. I should have trusted what we had built together, instead of trusting Victor's lies. I failed you, Elena, in the worst possible way, and I understand completely if you cannot simply forgive that failure, because I've finally learned the truth." Elena's eyes filled with tears she had been holding back for weeks, grief and anger and exhausted relief, all tangling together at once. "Do you have any idea what these past weeks have been like? Alone, terrified, not understanding why the man I loved had suddenly become a stranger, wondering every single day if I would ever see my daughter again." "I know," Damien repeated, his own eyes wet now as well. "And I cannot undo the pain those weeks caused you. All I can offer is everything within my power to make things right from this moment forward, if you'll allow me the chance." Elena wiped at her eyes fiercely, struggling to steady her voice. "Victor is in custody?" "He is," Damien confirmed. "The full council has seen the evidence against him. He will answer for everything he has done, publicly, before the entire pack, including his attempt to have you harmed. And Roth's man, the one captured last night, also in custody, and already confirming everything Victor ordered him to do, in exchange for a lighter sentence." Elena nodded slowly, processing the information, though the ache in her chest remained heavy and unresolved. "I need time," she said finally. "I cannot simply climb back onto Ash and ride home beside you as though none of this happened. Trust isn't rebuilt in a single conversation, Damien, however honest that conversation might be." "I understand," Damien said, and to Elena's surprise, there was no argument in his voice, only quiet acceptance. "Take whatever time you need. I will not push you toward forgiveness before you're ready to offer it honestly. I only ask that you allow me the chance to earn it back, however long that takes." They sat together in silence for a long while after that, the morning sun rising higher over the hills, neither quite ready to speak further, but neither willing to walk away entirely either. Eventually, Elena broke the silence with a question that had been weighing on her since the previous night. "Maya. How is she?" Damien's expression softened with genuine warmth for the first time since their conversation began. "She misses you terribly. Lila has cared for her wonderfully, but she asks for you every single day. She doesn't fully understand what happened, only that her mother is gone, and that absence has been hard on her." Fresh tears filled Elena's eyes, this time born entirely of longing rather than anger. "I want to see her." "Then let me take you home," Damien said gently. "Not as my mate returning to accept everything as it was before, if that isn't what you want. Simply as Maya's mother, returning to be with her daughter, for as long as you need to decide what comes next between us." Elena considered his words carefully, weighing the ache of missing her daughter against the raw, unresolved pain still sitting heavy in her chest regarding Damien himself. Finally, she nodded, slowly and deliberately. "For Maya," she said, "not yet for us. But for Maya, yes, I'll return." Relief and gratitude flickered across Damien's face, though he was careful not to overstep the boundary Elena had just drawn. "Thank you," he said simply, "for giving me even that much of a chance." They departed the hidden settlement later that morning, after Elena had said her heartfelt goodbyes to Nathan and thanked him properly for the safety and kindness his people had offered during her time there. The journey back toward Pack territory felt entirely different from the desperate flight that had carried her away weeks earlier, Damien riding respectfully alongside her rather than ahead, giving her the space she needed, while remaining close enough to offer protection should any further danger arise. They spoke little during the ride, the silence between them heavy with everything still unresolved. But it was not an unkind silence. It was the careful, tentative quiet of two people, beginning the slow, uncertain process of rebuilding something that had nearly been destroyed entirely, neither rushing toward false reconciliation, nor abandoning hope that reconciliation might, eventually, still be possible. Word of Elena's return spread through the pack house long before she and Damien actually arrived, and by the time their small party rode through the gates, a crowd had gathered, watching with a mixture of curiosity, relief, and lingering uncertainty about what her return truly meant. Elena held her head high as she dismounted, aware of the many eyes upon her, but her focus remained fixed entirely on reaching the nursery where her daughter waited. Maya's reaction, when Elena finally knelt before her and gathered the small girl into her arms, was worth every mile of the difficult journey home. Maya clung to her fiercely, tears streaming down her small face, repeating her mother's name over and over, as though needing to confirm this reunion was real and not simply another dream. Elena held her daughter close, her own tears falling freely now, unashamed in front of the small crowd that had gathered to witness the moment. The following days brought significant changes throughout the pack. Victor's public trial before the full council confirmed everything the evidence had already suggested, his own defiant testimony ultimately sealing his fate as he continued insisting, even facing judgment, that his actions had been necessary for the pack's greater good. The council, having heard the full truth, stripped him of all remaining influence and authority, and he was sentenced to permanent exile from pack territory, forbidden ever to return under threat of severe consequence. Damien, for his part, spent those same days working tirelessly to demonstrate through action, rather than words alone, that he intended to earn back Elena's trust genuinely. He gave her space when she needed it, remained patient through her moments of lingering anger or grief, and made a point of consulting her directly on matters concerning Maya, rather than assuming decisions on his own. Slowly, carefully, the walls Elena had built around her heart during those difficult weeks began, ever so gradually, to soften. It was nearly a month after her return when Damien finally approached her with a request that surprised her. He asked her to walk with him to the orchard, where they had once spent so many peaceful mornings together, before everything had fallen apart. Elena agreed, curious despite herself about what he intended. The orchard looked much the same as she remembered, rows of fruit trees heavy with the beginnings of the coming harvest, the afternoon sunlight filtering gently through the leaves. Damien stopped near the center of the orchard and turned to face her, his expression more vulnerable than she had seen since their initial reunion in the hidden settlement. "I've spoken with the council," he said. "I've told them I intend to step back from certain responsibilities for a time, delegating more authority to a newly formed advisory group, rather than concentrating decisions solely in my own hands. I want the pack to understand clearly that leadership built on trust and partnership, rather than unchecked power, is the future I intend to build here, exactly the opposite of everything Victor tried to convince me was necessary." Elena listened carefully, surprised by the significance of what he was describing. "That's a substantial change." "It is," Damien agreed, "but it felt necessary, both for the pack's future and for my own understanding of what kind of leader and what kind of partner I want to be going forward. I nearly lost everything that mattered most to me because I let fear and manipulation override the trust we had built together. I never want to make that mistake again, in any form." He stepped closer, though he stopped short of closing the distance entirely, leaving the choice to close it, if she wished, in Elena's hands. "I am not asking you to forget what happened, or to pretend the past weeks didn't cause you tremendous pain. I am only asking whether there might still be room, someday, for us to rebuild what we lost, not as it was before, perhaps, but as something stronger, built with far more honesty between us than we had allowed ourselves previously." Elena studied him for a long moment, feeling the weight of weeks of anger and grief slowly settling into something calmer, something closer to genuine hope than she had allowed herself to feel since that terrible night in the Great Hall. She thought of everything he had done since finding her, the patience, the transparency, the willingness to fundamentally change how he led, rather than simply apologizing and expecting everything to return to normal. "I still need time," she said finally, though her voice carried none of the sharp edges it had held during their conversation in the hidden settlement weeks earlier. "But I want you to know that I see the effort you've made. I see it, and it matters." Relief and cautious joy flickered across Damien's face. "That's all I could ask for." They stood together in comfortable silence for a while longer, watching sunlight shift through the orchard branches, and for the first time since her banishment, Elena allowed herself to imagine a future that might genuinely include reconciliation, not born from desperation or fear, but from patient, honest rebuilding. Several weeks later, on a bright morning marked by clear skies and a gentle breeze, the pack gathered once more in the Great Hall, though this occasion carried an entirely different weight than the terrible night that had once unfolded within those same walls. Elena stood beside Damien before the full council, Maya held gently in her arms, as Damien formally acknowledged before his people the wrong he had done and the trust Elena had shown in giving him the chance to make it right. "This pack," Damien said, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed hall, "was nearly torn apart by fear, manipulation, and my own foolish willingness to abandon trust for false certainty. I stand before you today, grateful beyond words, that the woman I love chose, despite everything, to give our family a chance to heal." Elena felt tears prick at her eyes as she listened, though these tears carried none of the sorrow of previous weeks, only the quiet fullness of watching genuine change unfold before her. When Damien turned to her at the end of his address, extending his hand not as a command but as a request, Elena stepped forward and took it, choosing, freely and deliberately, to stand beside him once more. Later that evening, as the pack celebrated the Queen's return with warmth and genuine joy, rather than the wary uncertainty of previous weeks, Elena found herself near the stables, Ash's familiar dark shape visible in the moonlight. She smiled softly, remembering the reckless, heartbroken decision that had led her to take the great stallion the night everything fell apart. Damien found her there a few minutes later, settling quietly beside her without a word. "I never did understand," he said eventually, a hint of warmth returning to his voice for the first time in longer than either of them cared to remember, "why you took Ash that night, of all things." Elena smiled, a genuine smile, small but real, the first she had offered him freely in weeks. "Because you loved him," she said simply. "And some part of me wanted to remind you that I still mattered, even as you were throwing me away." Damien reached for her hand, and this time, she let him take it. "You matter more than anything," he said quietly. "I understand that now, more completely than I ever have before." Together, they watched Ash graze peacefully in the moonlight, the great stallion who had carried Elena through danger and uncertainty, and finally back home again, standing now as a quiet witness to a family choosing, slowly and honestly, to heal.